Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for this morning, for another opportunity to study once again the foundation of this message. And we know, Lord, that there's no other foundation than that which can be laid, which is Christ Jesus. And we know, Lord, that as we study these prophecies, as we study our history, it's about the work that Christ has done for us. And we ask, Lord, that we can behold Christ, that we can see his righteousness, and that we can be drawn and lifted up from the cares of this world into your presence. May your Holy Spirit be here to teach and guide and direct each of us as we study together. And we thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So this part here today is going to be a review of basically the last couple of weeks, where we went through the Time of the End magazine, Daniel 11. So it's just some of the quotes that he actually had in that paper, in those papers, in those articles. The first one here is from Education 178. The history of nations that one after another have occupied their allotted time and place, unconsciously witnessing to the truth of which they themselves knew not the meaning, speak to us. To every nation and to every individual of today, God has assigned a place in his great plan. Today, men and nations are being measured by the plummet in the hand of him who makes no mistake. All are by their own choice deciding their destiny, and God is overruling all for the accomplishment of his purposes. The history which the great I Am has marked out in his word, uniting link after link in the prophetic chain, from eternity in the past to eternity in the future, tells us where we are today in the procession of the ages and what may be expected in the time to come. All that prophecy has foretold as coming to pass until the present time has been traced in the pages of history, and we may be assured that all which is yet to come will be fulfilled in its order. So there's a lot of things in this statement here. One thing on my Friday's video, there's a fellow guy, Osmond, who's a Calvinist, who for some reason came across my video and started attacking it. And so we're having a discussion, and right now we're discussing predestination, which he believes in. And so some of these statements, of course, address that very point. And so when we look at the history of nations and we look at the choices of individuals, God, he overrules these events, right? As his overruling all. So what does that mean, that God overrules our choices? Overrules the choices that man has made, either as individuals or as nations. I know you're just jumping into this discussion on predestination here. But
the sense of overruling something as the idea that someone's deciding to go this path, but God's saying, no, I'm not going to overrule that. You're not going to do that. But I don't think that is what the meaning of this verse would be.
Right.
I think it has more of a connotation that over everything, over the decisions we make, God is ruling over them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he has a purpose in spite of the choices that man has made. His purpose is ultimately accomplished.
If you look at the beginning of that, it says the history of nations that have occupied their allotted time and place. And then it says to every nation and to every individual of today. God has assigned a place. So he's not talking necessarily about, she's not talking about just individuals, she's talking about nations.
Yep. Yeah. So all of the events that have happened, and we've seen this because in the context of what we have been studying, we have seen that God has understood the smallest detail, dates, calendars. Long before the world was created, God had foreseen all the things that have happened. And for some people, this idea that God has foreseen things and that God is all powerful, so he's all knowing and he's omniscient, means that he must then be the cause of all the bad things that happen. Right? So if God knows all things before they happen and he's all powerful, then if something happens, well, God could have stopped that from happening. But what is the one thing that constrains God or holds back his hand from controlling our actions? What is the one thing that God cannot do?
Gives us freedom of choice.
Okay, it gives us freedom of choice, but why? What is it about God that he allows us freedom of choice?
Because that is what love does. Doesn't
God,
force.
yeah, God is love, right? So God can't act contrary to his nature. That is, he is love. And so, God may be all powerful, but it doesn't mean that he will act contrary to his nature. And so love is his very nature. In allowing us free will to make our choices, he has a purpose, and that purpose is love. It's not some kind of, God isn't sitting there as this sovereign who's just manifesting his power out of some kind of arbitrary will, right? He is motivated by love in the creation of the universe, in the creation of you and I as individuals. He has, and in the things that he has allowed us to go through, these are signs of his love, even though those things may seem difficult. And I understand this as a parent. So one thing I knew becoming a parent when I was 18 years old is I knew that my children's lives weren't going to be lives of constant bliss and happiness. I knew that they were going to have difficulties. And I knew that bringing a child into the world means that one of those children may have a terrible life. They may make choices that are going to cause them great misery. But because of love, I brought them into the world. And everything that I did in trying to raise them was to show them God's love so that they might choose to follow God. I mean, that was my purpose as a parent. And yet, they all have made different choices. Now, I could have, tried to control them. Of course, I'm not God. I'm not all powerful. But imagine if I did have the power to control them. Love wouldn't allow me to do that because anything that they did wouldn't be a response of love. It would just be control and manipulation. Even on the simplest level, I know I'm not God, but I mean, I could have power to manipulate my children if I had wanted to. Lots of people try to. But I understood from a pretty early age that manipulating people never benefits that individual. So, so God is the same. I mean, he's not the same as me. He's much better than I am. But at least from a love point of view, God knows that if he's going to have creatures that are going to respond in love, that they have to have free choice. And without God, free will does not exist. If we live in a materialistic universe, everything that has happened to us is just chance. And whether we're going to have a happy life or not, whether we're going to be rich or poor, whether we're going to be healthy or sick, those are just circumstances that really are arbitrary. They're just nothing that we can do can really change because we're not in control of our lives. We can make choices, but I mean, even those choices would have been predetermined. So to kind of say that to believe in predestination, to me, is also limiting God in a much different way, because then God has sort of set the bounds of who can be saved and who can be lost, and it makes God a very arbitrary ruler. I just can't understand how a Christian could believe in predestination. But anyway, one of the things is, as Adventists, we don't, thankfully, and I don't know many Adventists who do. It's one of those errors that has not crept into Adventism. But we know about prophecy. All prophecy, all that prophecy is foretold is coming to pass. And so we know that all of the prophecy that is coming to pass is God overruling all for the accomplishment of his purposes. So his purposes are to reveal his character and for us to reveal his character. And so that always needs to be kept in the forefront of our minds as we study prophecy. These are not things that we're studying just for our entertainment, for our intellectual stimulation of some sort. These are things that we're studying to understand God. So in this review here, he looks at Daniel 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So we know what this means. The time of the end in 1798, and then the time of the end in 1989, with the United States supporting the king of the north, which is the papacy. And they overflow and pass over. Now, we didn't actually look into a lot of these verses on overflowing and passing over, but there is in Isaiah chapter 8, talks about the overflowing scourge in Isaiah. And this overflowing is an army coming in and conquering. But we understand that this overflowing and passing over did not destroy atheism. So that's one of the points that we that we noticed is that Jeff was believing that when the USSR fell, that was the end of the King of the South. The King of the South has moved into the world and has become part of the UN. So the time of the end. But at the time of the end, says the prophet, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Daniel 12, verse 4. Since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. Knowledge of the prophecies has increased, and many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near. Now, the king of the south, he goes through this again, where it talks about the Negev, or the southern district of Judah, occasionally Egypt. It's the south part of Palestine, south of Palestine. Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, that covereth with the covering, but not as my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, that walk to go down into Egypt, and have not asked at my mouth, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust of the shadow of Egypt be your confusion. For his princes were at Zoan, and his ambassadors came to Hanes. They were all ashamed of a people that could not profit them, nor be an help or profit, but a shame also and a reproach. The burden of the beasts of the south, into the land of trouble and anguish, from whence come the young and old lion, the viper and the fiery flying serpent. They will carry their burdens on the shoulders of young asses, and their treasures upon the bunches of camels, to a people that shall not profit them. For the Egyptians shall help in vain, and to no purpose. Therefore have I cried concerning this. Their strength is to sit still. Isaiah 30, verse 1-7. So he brings us this here regarding Egypt. Now, Egypt is the king of the south. Now, Egypt also represents the world. And so the question is, why would we have limited this symbol of the king of the south to France or to the USSR? Wouldn't it have made more sense to recognize that at the end of time that this symbol of atheism The King of the South symbolism moves to the United Nations, to the globalists. Would that not have made more sense? Is it not more consistent with what he's saying here?
Looks obvious in retrospect.
Yeah, okay. In retrospect, things can be obvious. Now, I usually say hindsight is 50-50, not 20-20, but I think in this case, we definitely can look back and see that the reason why Jeff could not have seen what we now see is that from that perspective, he's just looking for the coming Sunday law. And so he's really in the same position as the Millerites were when they were looking for the second coming of Christ in 1843. It limits their view. And so now we sort of can look back and we can see, well, he should have seen what he was saying, but he didn't even see where his own words were leading. Now, regarding France, Ellen White says, this is atheism, and the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God and would manifest a like spirit of unbelief and defiance. And we see this in the United Nations as well. The speaking of the nation is the act of its legislative and judicial authorities. So that's talking about different nations, particularly the context there is going to be the United States when it speaks like a dragon. The worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. So the issue that happened in France is now going to happen on a worldwide scale. And he talks here about the word tending. So because all are tending to involve the whole world, that means actually to take a certain direction. So we don't generally use the word in that way now, or at least we may not understand it. So Jeff put this definition here for us, taking care of, American Dictionary of the English Language. That's Noah Weber's 1828 dictionary. And of course, the push, to butt with horns, figuratively, to war against, gore, push. So the idea of the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward is not a feeble resistance, which is what we saw in Lich's interpretation of the pushing that happened at the time of the end. So the King of South pushed at, in his interpretation, France, it was a feeble resistance, where really it was the King of the South, France, pushing at the King of the North, not Egypt feebly resisting France. And then the issue of the King of the North. And we went through this in detail, so I don't know if we need to go through this too much, other than we know that from the north, we have Babylon, because Babylon comes from the north. But Christ is the true King of the North. Clear annotations. Oh, somebody needs to clear those annotations. How do you do that? Can I do that? Or does, I think it was Jeff that did that. Drew those.
I think you should be able to as the host or the person who put it there.
Accidentally did it accidentally.
I just don't know how to do it. Yeah, I know you accidentally.
I don't know what I did. I don't know what I did, but
yeah, I don't know either. We had this happen before. I don't remember how. Yeah, I got what I could do, I think, is if I go stop share. And then
okay, yeah, there, that might do it. Try to keep my fingers clear.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I can turn that off so people can't do that. I just don't know how.
Yeah, I'm not trying to scribble everything over.
Yeah. Okay, so, and then we know come against him like a whirlwind. And that was, of course, repeated in the popular press. The days of the whirlwind, the chariots having to do with military power. So we have Bible verses on that. And then the ships have to do with economic power. Now he's going to deal with this overflow a little bit, overflow and pass over, to gush, inundate, cleanse. But he doesn't give us any verses, which he could have given us verses regarding this overflowing. But a lot of this wasn't really noticed till later, even earlier in Daniel chapter 11, where you the overflowing. We have that overflowing in Daniel. Where is it? Daniel chapter 11.
Verse 10.
10, yeah, verse 10. But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. One shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then he shall return and be stirred up even to his fortress. So this overflowing happens typically in different times. So that becomes a type, this battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, having this overflowing again. So that's one of the keys that helped us to understand the repeat of Daniel, that it wasn't just applying to the king of the north and the king of the south in 1989, that we could take that king of the north and the king of the south and apply them later on. Now, it's one of the points that we still have to, sorry about that. We still have to address is, how we're going to now interpret Daniel 11 as we make an application of those histories. Because part of the thing that we did is we took this king of the north and the king of the south to be Russia and the United States. And we can see that where we placed that definitely was not correct. We didn't have a battle between the Russia and the United States on the dates that we expected. But we have now taken a position, at least tentatively, that possibly that the king of the north can at least refer to republicanism, and the king of the south refer to the Democrats, so the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, and that the battle of the king of the south winning over the king of the north could be seen at January 6th. Some people suggest January 20th. But I would say with the siege that occurred of Washington, that would be this battle that occurred, and who won that battle, because it was more an information war than anything, was the Democrats. So the Republicans, let's say, having greater forces, should have won, based on everything logically, but the Democrats ended up winning that public relations battle, and almost brought about the end of Trump. I mean, things could have gone a lot worse for Trump, except that people finally came at least halfway to their senses afterwards. From Selected Messages, Book 2, 102, and we've read this statement lots, but historical events showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy were set before the people, and prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this earth's history. The scenes connected with the working of the man of sin are the last features plainly revealed in this earth's history. And so lots in this statement, but right now just focusing upon the scenes connected with the working of the man of sin. Now, this working, of course, continues on. It's not something that just, we just look at it at the very end. There is this progression of events that are occurring. So who is the man of sin?
The papacy.
Okay, so it is the papacy, right? So the papacy, its work is, of course, the work of Satan, right? So this is the manifestation of satanic power in the last days, is through the working of the man of sin. The man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposeth all that is above God, or that is called God, or that is worshipped. So he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So the working of the man of sin had its historical manifestation in the 1260 years, but it is revived here at the end, and that's what we see happening now. Part of understanding those events, of how it works out, I think has been the problem, because we've looked at it in a rather, maybe simplistic way of how the papacy was going to take over the United States. And the world is a little more complex than that. There's lots of players involved. There's lots of countries. There's battles on different fronts. It just doesn't happen in the way that we imagined it might happen. And it's happening in a way that is more consistent with human nature. I think a lot of the problems that I had in the past with Adventist understanding of end time events is it wasn't really consistent with human nature. That is, I don't really know how to express it, other than that it wasn't taking into account how people are motivated or meant to act. We just looked at the fear factor, and fear is a big part of it. But there's a lot of other motivations that people have. And, we can see this manifest in how people communicate on Facebook, or how people come to believe error. People live in a pretty much an imaginary world today, and maybe they always have. But people are also becoming very distrustful of government. Society is breaking down. Some of the things that held society together in the past are breaking down, because trust is breaking down. And so the events that end up operating in causing people to act are not as simple as we once thought. So it talks here about the ongoing war. So when the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV decided to seek pardon of Pope Gregory VII in 1077, he stood barefoot for 3 days in the snow outside the papal quarters in Canossa, Italy. Though Gorbachev's concordat with the church was less arduous, it was no less significant in its way. December 11th, that's from Time Magazine, 1989. What is this referring to? What's Gorbachev's concordat with the church? What is that? Why is Jeff placing this statement here?
Well, they had a secret meeting before taking Russia down.
Okay.
It's noted in one of those magazine articles.
Yeah. So this first reference to Henry IV to seek pardon from Pope Gregory VII in 1077. So how is this parallel being made by this writer in Time Magazine? What is he comparing? What is he trying to say?
He's illustrating the power and authority that the Pope once had. Okay.
Yeah, so the Pope is now being consulted on world affairs. There is this sort of acquiescence somewhat to the papacy in order to for world leaders to make decisions. So the papacy, in a sense, has gained its power back. I think that's what's trying to be illustrated by this, right? So the title in the U.S. News and World Report was Gorby's Bow to the Roman Legions. The Soviet's President's Session Friday with Pope Paul II is the latest development of a revolution in the communist world that the Pope helped spark and Gorbachev has allowed to happen. Until recently, the battalions of Marxism seemed to have the upper hand over the soldiers of the cross. In the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Lenin had pledged toleration but delivered terror. Russia turned crimson with the blood of martyrs, says Father Gleb Yakunin, Russian Orthodoxy's bravest agitator for religious freedom. In the Bolsheviks' first 5 years in power, 28 bishops and 1,200 priests were cut down by the Red Sickle. Stalin greatly accelerated the terror, and by the end of Khrushchev's rule, liquidation of the clergy reached an estimated 50,000. After World War II, fierce but generally less bloody persecution spread into the Ukraine, and the new Soviet bloc, affecting millions of Roman Catholics and Protestants, as well as Orthodox. So, one of the things we see here in the rise of Marxism, we see this what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution in the USSR, the forming of Russia, which led to the USSR. Do we see a parallel today? Because we believe that the Soviet Union fell. And we're going to see this here. Now, it talks here also about the Fatima Miracle was also in 1917. So again, we don't have Jeff's words here. We just have these statements from presentations that he would do. The rush to freedom in Eastern Europe was a sweet victory for John Paul II. So what would be the connection? Why is he talking here about the Fatima Miracle in connection with the Soviet Revolution?
John Paul II was a devotee of the Fatima Miracle.
Right. So there is this connection between the Fatima Miracle and the prophecy, and how the papacy saw this prophecy of Fatima, and John Paul II in particular. So he believed that Mary was leading this revolution. So one of the things we see here that's interesting, so we have the time of the end in 1798, which is brought about by France. And then that revolution moves to the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, at the time that revolution is occurring, there's also occurring within Catholicism a new type of spiritual revival. And I think it's really hard for us in the present day to understand the power that the Catholic Church once held, especially in Eastern Europe, and not so much even the Roman Catholic Church particularly, though it did, but even just Catholicism in general, whether it's Russian Orthodoxy. There was really this type of, and I can't think of a better word for it than superstition. Catholics are very superstitious. Now, we're kind of free from that, being Seventh-day Adventists. Adventism is not a mystical type of religion. But for many Catholics, their religion is very magical. And in Russia, hermits, all different kinds of ascetics were venerated. So you'd have priests and monks and people who would, these sort of wise men. There was a lot of magic going on, is what I would call it. And what happened in the Fatima Miracle was really just a sign of what, and this, of course, is in Portugal. But the way that caught up on, not just in Roman Catholicism, but even to a large extent in all Catholicism, there was this mystical power that was brought to play. And so this mysticism, or this spirit of mysticism, really is what motivated and controlled a lot of what happened at the end of the Soviet experiment, if you want to call it that. But you see it happening at the beginning. So there's being infused into Catholicism, this new spirit. Maybe it's not new, but this Fatima Miracle, that's ultimately going to be the cause of the fall of the Soviet Union. Am I overstating it too much, that we could say that Fatima led to the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, it contributed to John Paul II's thinking. I believe the third message from Fatima has to do with Russia.
Right. So I don't think that Pope John Paul II would have been as motivated, or even because one of the reasons there was this strong belief that they had to conquer Russia. Now, Tess brought this out in her studies when she went through the story of Fatima, of what happened with the Catholic Church sort of obsession with Russia. So I don't think it would have occurred if it had not been for the Fatima Miracle. So what happened on October 13th, 1917, led to, in the end, the fall of the Soviet Union. But it's happening at the time that the Soviet Union is rising. So, 72 years later, the Soviet Union falls as a result of whatever this was, whatever this Fatima Miracle really was. It was definitely something that was motivated by satanic power to help the papacy once again control the throne of the earth. John Paul II pledged himself to Mary as if he were an instrument. Yeah, I didn't read the rest of that. It's just a comment on the chat. Instrument to conquer the USSR. Yeah, so that's the way that Pope John Paul saw himself. And so this goes all the way back to the Fatima manifestations.
Somewhere Ellen White says the spiritual powers are in conflict, which means I guess they're in conflict with each other until they unite to oppose the good.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just the nature of evil. Evil, one of the problems that evil has. So good has advantages and disadvantages, and evil has advantages and disadvantages, if we want to kind of put it in those terms. So the weakness that good has is that good is constrained or by righteousness. That is, God can't act in such a way that's contrary to his nature. He's always going to do things being true and honest, and on a short-term, perspective, sometimes being honest doesn't turn out the way that you want it to. So for instance, good people are often, in the court system. I'm thinking of that's a good example where I've seen it happen a lot. Is that people who are honest and open and go to court often get the short end of the stick, where the person who is, on the wrong side of the issue can manipulate the system in a way that a righteous person wouldn't. That is, they can lie and get away with it, but a righteous person only has the truth on his side. And sometimes the truth can't compete against lies on short-term issues. I don't know really the best way to illustrate that. So, but when it comes to the evil side, the evil can use lies to manipulate to get what they want. So on a short-term perspective, they seem to have an advantage. The other thing is that people who are righteous, if they're working together, they can have a unity that evil can't. Because if you have people who are evil, let's say you have an organization and you have people who are self-seeking, the organization can be hindered by the infighting that goes on behind the scenes. So that's a disadvantage of being evil and an advantage to being good. But so they both have their advantages and disadvantages. But when it comes to this idea of the infighting that you're talking about, you have all of these powers seeking to control the world for selfish means. But behind them all is Satan. And Satan himself is extremely short-sighted, which doesn't seem to make much sense in the context that he has, from a human perspective, long-term plans. But just his very nature of Pride is short-sighted. It seeks only its immediate pleasures, and doesn't understand what self-sacrifice means. And self-sacrifice in the long term, God's way in the long term, wins out, but it never appears to on the short term, or rarely appears to on the short term. Anyway, dealing with he shall overflow, rush, and pass through. In private meetings with heads of state, backroom consultants with the dissonant groups, and persistent propagandizing for his crusade against tyranny, he, John Paul II, has helped bring about the greatest policy change since the Russian Revolution. So you can see that this overflowing and this passing through, or passing over, is seen by Jeff here in 1989 as the King of the North conquering the King of the South. So this is the papacy with the United States overthrowing the Soviet Union. And so it gives us some statements about this history that happened in 1989. This next one from Life, December 1989. In 1935, Joseph Stalin, absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, was given some unsolicited advice, and we've read this before. Make a propitiatory gesture to the Vatican, he was told. Push too far, his country's Catholics might become counter-revolutionary. Stalin's great mustache amplified his sneer. The Pope, and how many divisions has he? The answer then was that he had none. The answer now is that he needs none. The structures of communism are crumbling to the touch. And so you can see there, pride is an example of short-sightedness on Stalin's part. The papacy, of course, is evil as well, but it tends to be a lot more far-seeing than individuals. But even in the end, the papacy, its search for power, to seek to have the throne of the earth, is really short-sighted because it doesn't consider eternity. So the King of the South pushed against the King of the North. So while Gorbachev's hands-off policy was the immediate cause of the chain reaction of liberty that has swept through Eastern Europe in the past few months, John Paul deserves much of the longer-range credit. Now, I'm not sure why they have the King of the South pushing against the King of the North in the context of these statements, because this is the King of the North coming in like a whirlwind against the King of the South. So this is 1989. So he's going to repeat a lot of these different things. So, and I'm not sure of Jeff's, his train of thought as he's going through these different statements in his presentations, but these are sermon notes, right? So we don't have his words, we just have these various titles or headings, and then his choice of references that he wants to read and comment on. So we can see the chariots and the horsemen. This is, it says, Gorbachev has also grasped the fact that political and economic survival depends upon the goodwill of the Soviet people, among whom Christians have always outnumbered communists. Gorbachev, moreover, needs the cooperation of the West, observes Father Mark, a reform-minded Orthodox priest in Moscow, who considers Gorbachev's program within the USSR a result of foreign policy necessity. So it's the pressure, the military pressure, and also the economic pressure that was placed against the Soviet Union that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, one of the things that happened in 2016 is Jeff had brought up this book. I know part of the title is Lies. It was written by an ex-KGB who talked about the plans of the USSR, and that in basically surrendering the USSR, that they were actually having these long-term plans. They knew that they couldn't win that immediate battle in 1989, and so that they would then eventually regroup to come against the United States at some later time. So,
Playing dead.
yeah, basically that kind of idea. I can't remember the name of the book. Truth and Lies, or Lies and something. Anyway, I know he had part of the cover removed from the book because he had cut out a picture which he used for some reason. But this idea then that Russia was now rising was part of the thing that led to our view that this was going to be a battle between Russia and the United States. So if we look at how Gorbachev sort of allowed the USSR to be dismantled, well, the belief by this author was that this was purposeful, right, playing dead, so to speak, and that it would catch the Americans off guard, and that what we have with what's his name, the guy now in charge of Russia, Putin, Vladimir Putin, that he was basically raised up to come against the United States with the belief that they could then conquer the U.S. Now, we know that there was this whole discussion of this information war. There was a lot of talk back in 2017 whether we were going to have a hot war against U.S. and Russia, whether this idea of the information war ended up turning into a belief, a type of conspiracy theory of the left that that Russia was somehow trying to manipulate the media, and that Fox News would be basically controlled by Russia, and that these two streams of information, one was CNN, that was the good stream, and then Fox News would be the bad stream. This idea being brought in by Parminder and Tess. So there was this whole issue around what this battle was, and how it was going to be waged. But I think one thing that we could see quite clearly, that the side, if you want to take sides on this issue, the side that was that Tess took really was not the side of righteousness. It was the side of Marxism, and Tess having AOC as her hero, somebody who's definitely a Marxist. This idea, I don't know how many people really recognize this, but I recognized it when I first started listening to Tess and even talking to her personally, is that she was a Marxist, which I thought was very odd, because she didn't look like a Marxist. But I knew she was a Marxist. She was a socialist, and I wasn't necessarily alarmed by it. I just thought it was a kind of naivety on her part, just something that young people think that socialism is somehow this wonderful thing. But I never imagined it turning into what happened, that we would see all these young people follow into this Omega. So when it comes to this issue of the King of the South and the King of the North, I think that we could look at it on different levels. One is we could see that what happened in this movement was also the King of the South pushing at the King of the North. So in that context, the King of the North would be the Alpha, and the King of the South would be the Omega. Yeah, New Lies for Old. That's the name of the book. The Communist Strategy for, what's the name of the book? The Communist Strategy of Deception and Disinformation. Now, when it comes to the media and you want to know what is truth, one thing you know is that both sides, whatever channels you have, are really mixtures of truth and error. And the only safe guide is God's word. So that was one of the problems with this two streams of information idea, is that both are wrong, both are evil. And Jeff saw this, and he had a hard time accepting what was being presented. But anyway, the point is, did we have a battle? Can we say that we had a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south in this movement? Would that be a stretch?
No, not at all. It was, since you've defined the terms, we can see it very clearly.
Yeah. Now, one of the things too about the king of the north and the king of the south, we know that the king of the north, it's the papacy, as well, right? So the king of the north, the papacy becomes the king of the north. But the true king of the north is Christ. But we can take all these kings of the norths and the kings of the souths, in history. We can look at, Judah and Israel, the civil war that happened there. We can look at the United States Civil War. In the United States Civil War, it's still human battles, so humans are imperfect, but the North was on the side of the right when it came to the issue of slavery. And they had to make reforms in the North. They weren't perfect in everything that they did. But the South was Democrat. The North was Republican. And so it was a battle between Republicans and Democrats. And Republicans were standing for the Constitution. Democrats weren't. They had their own constitution, which really wasn't much different, but it didn't see the equality of the races, the so-called races of humanity, right? Saw blacks as inferior. And, we can see within the United States today that this racial tension has basically swelled once again into a civil war. We have a civil war going on in the US, and the Republicans are on the side of the Constitution, that all men should be treated equally. The Democrats, and it's such a contradictory thing, because the Democrats speak words talking about racial equality, but they're the ones who are the most oppressive towards blacks in the United States.
It's not just toward the blacks.
It's towards who else?
Well, when you look at the history, especially going back with Andrew Jackson,
Okay.
he was very dismissive of the American Indian.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we're talking about a group that believes in white superiority, we're talking about the Democrats across the board.
Yeah.
This is one of the points that led to the formation of the Republican Party, because the Republicans believed that all men are created equal, just as Thomas Jefferson put out in the Declaration and in the Bill of Rights. So the points that have come out is those Democrats that wish to remain as slaveholders were trained and well trained by the Jesuits. And their belief in white superiority was strengthened by the teachings of the Jesuits. So
and it's just so bizarre to me, though, because it's very, at least from a Canadian's perspective, America is very divided, and the racism that exists, for the most part, is not, white supremacy. You don't really see much of that in the United States. It's mostly hatred towards whites that I see in the United States. I don't think, black people need to be scared about walking through a white neighborhood and getting beat up, but you sure have to worry about it if you're a white person walking through a black neighborhood.
that we have this current manufactured racism toward Asians now too.
Yeah, where there's no racism toward Asians in the United States that I know of. Because talking about China is not talking about the Chinese as a race. It's talking about a country. You know, China is a despotic a dictatorship. And
Since the 1980s, there's been quite a bit of race baiting, especially against those that are Occidental. I mean, we in these situations, this kind of situation was being put out from Britain. It was being put out in the United States that you couldn't trust the Japanese, you couldn't trust the Chinese, you couldn't trust those that were different from you. So all of this adds together to saying and promoting kind of a race hatred situation.
yeah, I mean, you know, growing up the way that I haven't seen race hatred in Canada. I mean, maybe on a very, very small scale in a few individuals here or there. But the media really plays it up all the time. I remember it was a number of years ago, there was a Canadian, I think it was in Toronto, some kind of politician of some sort. Maybe he was just like an alderman or something, or what they call city councilors now. But he had mentioned something about Orientals. And it wasn't in sort of a disparaging way. He just used the word Oriental. And he had to apologize. Now, I said at the time, I wouldn't have apologized. I just would have said it was an Occidental remark. Or, you know, because the whole idea, just calling somebody from Oriental, you just mean they're from the East. And we're from the West. It's not disparaging. And you can still buy Oriental noodles. That's not considered racist. It just seemed to me very, very odd that an issue was made by using the word Oriental to refer to somebody from the Orient. And I didn't know when that word all of a sudden became bad usage. But this is the kind of thing that the media does. They make and it's usually because it's a political opponent of some sort. So you have to make them look like a racist. So in Canada, which is a really unracist place to live, we have constant race baiting in the media. And so if you're a conservative in Canada, you're automatically called a racist, even though you don't have a racist bone in your body. So there's this new terminology of racism, which doesn't really mean anything. It's just propaganda. So anyway, this is kind of a little bit off the topic, but part of what we see happening in the world today is that we have this manufactured division that has eventually multiplied into real division in the United States. And so the Civil War in the United States is something that's real. It's not.
It illustrates the Bible text that says a man can be made an offender for a word.
Yeah.
We're there again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always, and this is one of the problems with being a Christian. I'm always going to treat every person as an individual, and I'm always going to treat them with respect. And I'm not going to make a man an offender for a word. If somebody misspeaks, I'm not going to hold that against them and demand that, and try to get them removed from some position just so I can advance myself. But these types of manipulations, I'm often surprised that the public falls for it. It's like, don't people have a bit of sense to realize that just because somebody says some word that, you know, all of a sudden is not approved, that makes him a racist. You know, it's just kind of silly. It's how we treat one another and I've always treated every person as an individual, no matter, you know, I'm not even prejudiced against lawyers. I'll treat them as human beings too, you know. So no matter who a person is, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're from a class that, you know, that as a class we might despise, when it comes to that individual, you have to treat them as an individual. And yet what we have in the world today is identity politics, where people are not treated as individuals. They're treated as part of a group or a class. So, you know, white people are all evil. And we had this in our movement. We overheard a conversation that somebody was having, a black person, on a phone when we were at the School of the Prophets. And they despised white people. It was very clear in this conversation we overheard, which we didn't mean to. It just, the person was talking very loud, and so we couldn't have helped but overhear what they were saying about white people. And I was just like, you know, maybe I should have talked to them about it, but it just seemed to me just so bizarre that somebody could talk about another person in this movement and just disparage them because they're white. You know, I would never do that because somebody's anything, you know, any kind of race or anything. I would never think down on that person because of what their race is. But yet that was in our movement, and it's something that exists in the United States. Definitely, you know, it might exist in Canada on a very, very small scale, a few individuals here and there, but Canadians never think about race. You never think about, when you're hiring somebody, whether they're white or black or native or anything. You know, you always take each person as an individual. So, but the media has definitely played up all of this, especially, you know, like we now see with the Chinese, where nobody cares whether you're Chinese or not, or Japanese. But we can say things about China itself because China is an evil state, but it's not saying anything about the Chinese. That's a government. Anyway, it's kind of a little bit off topic in some ways, but I guess it is sort of relevant. Now, so looking at, you know, because these are a lot of different statements about what was happening in the United States or in the Soviet Union in 1989, with the United States and the Papacy working together. It says, in the 1980s, communist economies, always inefficient, went belly up. So that's one of the things that was happening in the Soviet Union, is that they were really having a hard time in the 80s. Before they had lacked consumer and luxury goods, now perennial shortages of staples worsened as well. When Soviet miners went on strike in 1989, their demands included soap, toilet paper, and sugar. So part of the reason is, you know, I mean, the Soviet Union could have maybe blamed the American pressure, and we somehow give the Americans, or, you know, because they did put economic pressure on the Soviet Union, especially with the arms race. So a lot of Soviet resources were being put into trying to keep up with the Americans. But really, the Soviet experiment could not have lasted forever. You cannot have an economy controlled at the top, because you're not going to know where resources should be allocated in order to efficiently use your resources. Plus, people become very unmotivated if the work that they're doing isn't going to be rewarded in any way. And especially in a lot of ways, it's almost the opposite of rewarded, whatever that would be. So you put efforts and energies into things, and you're actually worse off. So you're better just taking advantage of this system. So the Soviet system didn't survive. Now, we have China has survived with a socialist economy. Maybe not as well as they would have if they had. Definitely, they would have been better off if they never had a communist revolution in China. But the difference there has to do with the attitude of the Chinese compared to that of Russians. Russians were very lazy, not very industrious naturally, where the Chinese had a value system of honor and responsibility that allowed them to be more motivated. But people still lived in poverty in China, and still many do, because of the command economy. You just can't have economy function well. Now, in some ways, China isn't really as communist. It is a dictatorship. There is a lot of underground economy that works, black markets and so on. And the same in the Soviet Union, that actually helped people to survive. But it's definitely less productive than you would have a country like the United States, which is extremely productive because of the freedoms that exist in the US. And of course, that's going to be taken away by the Democrats to undermine American, the motivation to work is being undermined by socialism. So the issue of the deadly wound being healed. Now, one of the things that ended up happening here back in the time of both Reagan and John Paul was this assassination attempt. And I remember Adventists talking about it as something to do with the deadly wound, that when the Pope got shot, that was the deadly wound. So, I mean, it's definitely, interesting in that perspective. But of course, we know the deadly wound was in 1798. But both Reagan and John Paul had survived these assassination attempts. Says here, though, regarding this connection, only President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul were present in the Vatican Library on Monday, June 7th, 1982. It was the first time the two had met, and they talked for 50 minutes. So this is the meeting where they came together and devised this plan to overthrow the Soviet Union, right? So it lists all the different things that they had planned, and compare some of these with the scripture, different scripture passages. So Reagan came with very simple and strongly held views, says Admiral Bobby Inman, former deputy director of the CIA. It is a valid point that he saw the collapse of communism coming, and he pushed it hard. During the first part of 1982, a five-part strategy emerged that was aimed at bringing about the collapse of the Soviet economy. So the U.S. defense buildup already underway aimed at making it too costly for the Soviets to compete militarily with the U.S. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, became a centerpiece of the strategy. And covert operations, so they reference with horses, not by his own power, Daniel 8:24. Covert operations aimed at encouraging reform movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. He shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, Daniel 9:25. Financial aid at Warsaw Pact. And it's interesting there, if you look at these verses that he's using, what is he referencing here as he's looking at what happened in 1989? He's looking at other verses in Scripture to illustrate this. And he could have used even other verses in Daniel 11. So you can see that this parallel of Daniel, not just Daniel 11, but even other parts of Daniel, really address the issues of the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. They had an increased use of Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe to transmit administration's messages to the people of Eastern Europe. And like all great lucky leaders, the Pope and the President exploited the forces of history to their own ends. And that's through his policy. So one of the things that we talked about, so we're looking at his notes, his sermon notes here. Here's another study on Daniel 11, part 3. dealing with the impending Sunday law. Heretofore, those who presented the third angel's message have often been regarded as mere alarmists. Their predictions that religious intolerance would gain control in the United States, that church and state would unite to persecute those who keep the commandments of God, have been pronounced groundless and absurd. But as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the event so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching, and the third message will produce an effect which it could not have had before. So what is Ellen White talking here about? What is this issue that that she's addressing?
Well, the Sunday law crisis is going to cast its shadow before some people will see that and be able to react to.
So one of the things in her day, if you were looking at the United States in the 1880s, could you possibly have imagined that the Catholic Church would have the influence to bring about a Sunday law in the United States? I mean, we weren't alive then.
No, well, the Catholicism was regarded as dead then too, and out for the count totally.
Yeah. So the idea that Catholicism could somehow gain the power in the United States, in the land of the free, Americans were not interested in removing religious liberty. They wanted religious liberty. They understood the principles of religious liberty. Now, obviously, there were some churches pushing for the idea that we need to have more strict Sunday laws, because Sunday laws already existed. What they would call blue laws. I mean, so stores weren't open on Sunday. Even when I was growing up, stores weren't open on Sunday. You couldn't go shopping for groceries on Sunday. You might have at first some corner stores being open. But people generally were Sunday keepers, and they weren't usually concerned about what other people were doing because it didn't affect them that much. So it wouldn't really matter that somebody wasn't keeping Sunday because they were, and pretty much everybody else was. Now, the issue that came up in 1888 or prior to 1888 had to do with the World's Fair. So this was the World's Fair in Chicago, I believe, where A.T. Jones, he got to speak to a Senate committee regarding this. And so this was going to be a national law that was going to have the World's Fair closed on Sunday. So Jones spoke against it, and that bill was called the Blair Bill. It was quashed, and to a large part because of Jones' testimony. So, this was the agitation of Sunday back in those days. So there's always been people trying to agitate Sunday, Sunday laws. But, as time went on, especially if we look at in our day, we would see that the world is pretty much secular. Maybe United States is pretty Christian, especially parts of it. But even then, lots of the United States is secular. It has no interest in having Sunday laws. And so the question would be, Adventists, of course, are focused on it. We pick up anything we see in the newspapers regarding it. Whether it's labor unions, whether it's the Pope mentioning Sunday. But really, the average person, if you presented this idea that there's going to be a Sunday law, they would just look at you kind of sideways. They wouldn't think that this really makes much sense, that anybody's going to be enforcing Sunday. Now, Ellen White says here in The Great Controversy, but as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the offense so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching. Now, of course, that didn't happen in her day, but it had begun. So we know that this work of agitating Sunday had begun. And we are seeing it today. But what really has to happen for the Sunday law to come into play? That's the question. It's not just enough about some agitation or some suggestion by some labor unions or even the Pope writing some encyclical where he mentions that, you know, we should go back to church. What has to happen for a Sunday law to be enforced? What has to happen for this prophecy to be fulfilled? According to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45.
Must be
What's that?
Go ahead, Stephen.
in the legislation, and must be a law in the assembly of the government.
Okay, but what's going to bring that about? What would have to happen for that to occur?
Removal of temporal prosperity.
Okay,
I was going to say, yeah, the great fear that needs to be stirred up somehow. And removal of temporal prosperity is really scary. So that could be it. Yeah, well, definitely is part of it.
okay. So, I'm sort of playing the devil's advocate here, but so let's say you have temporal prosperity disappear. Why would that cause people to be, or would that cause people to be suddenly religious and that they think that the answer is going to be a Sunday law, that we actually have to enforce Sunday, and that's going to bring back temporal prosperity? But why would that be a motivation for that if you have a secular society?
Well, there has to be a supernatural event acknowledged to really destroy the temporal prosperity. The COVID-19 thing might just be an introduction to that.
Okay, so I don't know, here in Canada, COVID-19 hasn't made people more religious.
Okay, so let's look at this in a broader sense.
Okay,
What this scamdemic has done has been to separate people so they're not communicating with each other face to face as they have, and they're separating families, they're separating friends. I mean, it's creating issues. We have to agree to that.
yeah,
But what will happen if all of a sudden your job, your home, everything that you have worked for is now being removed? One of the problems that I'm seeing coming is in these hot real estate markets, people are going out and putting themselves in debt at a pace that's unprecedented. If all of a sudden all of these necessary things,
yeah,
your home, your vehicle, and your job are all of a sudden removed from you, you have no way of being able to pay for anything. You have no way of being able to go forward in the way you think it's necessary. Then how scared are these people going to be? How willing are these sheep going to be to follow someone that preaches peace and prosperity?
yeah. So we can see that there has to be a change that comes about. Now, Angela put a quote there that Satan's personation of Christ. He's going to say that he's changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. But Satan's personation of Christ doesn't come till after the close of probation. It's definitely not connected with a national Sunday law in the United States. So now we could see that there's the Sunday law coming in the United States, and the United States becomes a leader in this, and that this movement becomes worldwide with the United States behind it. So we know the United States is a Christian nation. It's a Protestant nation built upon the principles of the gospel, which is enshrined in the Constitution. So Americans at least have this heritage of being religious. but the average American really has no interest in this. So part of what has happened, so this is just me talking a little bit. So I've looked at the United States, I've looked at this situation, I've thought about this Sunday law issue, for 40 some years. So when we look at, and I've always thought of it in the sense of a backlash. That is, you have in the United States right now, the King of the South is pushed at the King of the North. And you have this experiment, and it's in a very divided US. So you have the media talking about basically depicting Republicans as a bunch of backwards religious hicks who are, pretty much not hip and happening, and all the cool dudes are following this new movement of Black Lives Matters and the LGBTQ plus and everything like that. So you have this, but and people are scared. I mean, and I see it in Canada even. People are not willing to speak out because they don't want to be labeled. Even if you're opposed to Black Lives Matters, you better not post that on Facebook because you might lose a lot of friends. Even though those friends might agree with you, they have to distance themselves from you because their friends might distance themselves from them. So you have to be very, very careful. And that's something that never existed before. You could have an opinion. You weren't going to be canceled. But now you have this pressure coming from this movement that really, I don't think is supported by the majority of Americans or Canadians or even people in the world. People just kind of put up with it. The media has pushed an agenda that the average person really doesn't agree with. But then you're going to have, at some point, under this democratic government, everything falls apart. And America goes into a major civil war. Well, somebody's going to have to come and clean up the mess. And it's going to be those that have been canceled and oppressed and put down as, white supremacists or whatever. But the point that I have a struggle with is that, it couldn't be the good ones. It would have to be the bad ones who are just taking opportunity to go into power. So just like there's bad Democrats, there's bad Republicans. There's the ones who want to control as much as the Democrats, even though they may stand on the side of good in word, in action, they will be just as bad or maybe even worse. So something has to happen in the United States. I think there's a number of things, obviously economic problems and, a civil war, all these types of things. But the idea of just that it's going to be a religious issue has to be a backlash. There has to be something, and maybe even something that people see as a judgment from God. I think that would be the biggest thing. So, if we saw Nashville hit by fireballs and destroyed, would that not be seen as a judgment from God that would cause people to turn, in a sense, back to God, even if it's not totally sincere?
Okay, but Nashville is one point. What if instead of just one point, you had Nashville being hit by a fireball, San Francisco hit by another earthquake, other issues hitting Los Angeles, and then Chicago destroyed by a major windstorm? Now, I believe all four of those have been noted by Mrs. White.
Yes.
So what if all of those happened roughly at the same time?
Yeah. See, that's what I'm thinking, is that you have to have basically things that are considered acts of God happening in quick succession, where there's going to be this, it's not a true turning to God, but a turning to God as a type of solution, and also having some group as a scapegoat. Right? So you have to find, who's to blame. And so there has to be a progression of events that I don't think I've ever really seen a good scenario of how events are going to unfold. I've seen very simplistic ones, that Adventists have laid out. But I think the issues are way more complex, and to have everyone basically stand, the majority stand behind such an oppressive law as a solution to the problem that they have, which of course would not be a rational solution. The solution would not be, well, we're going to force other people to keep Sunday. That people themselves would choose to do so. That's one thing. But to bring it about by legislation, that's another thing. And we know that it has to come about by legislation, because that's when the United States speaks as a dragon. It's through its legislative assemblies. So, these are the issues that, as Seventh-day Adventists, we've been grappling with. And when we look at what was happening in 1997 here, where Jeff is looking at the events that have unfolded, and he looks at the coming Sunday law, I mean, we definitely have a much better perspective than Jeff had, but we still have the same scriptures that he had. And what he's laying down here in the scriptures, what he's showing from the Great Controversy, is what we are now seeing be fulfilled before our very eyes. He may not have seen or understood what he was saying, but we can see that it's definitely happening now. And so we're going to develop this as time goes on, as we go on in our studies, when we start to address the lines more specifically, and especially when we start looking at that Sunday law after it comes after 9/11, and as we start to lead up to that Sunday law, on how Jeff was seeing it, and especially even when we go back to 2020, what we were expecting to happen. So this becomes a really important issue, looking back at what Jeff was saying about the Sunday law, and what we believe as Seventh-day Adventists about the Sunday law. So any more comments on that? Because those are some good comments by people there.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to this tomorrow, and I'm going to, as we start going through some of this, going through the future news articles, I'm going to bring some different things to play as we start to go through these notebooks. But yeah, we'll try to get through the Sunday law, but I want to bring some other things to play on this. And just trying to figure out what I'm going to do tomorrow. I mean, we will read this tomorrow, but I'm going to start drawing some of these things on a line, drawing these things out on the whiteboard and going through them as well. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for this study. We know, Lord, that there's still much we do not understand. And as we look at the coming Sunday law, we know, Lord, that you're asking us to make decisions in our day-to-day life, in all the little things that will develop a character that will be able to stand that trying time. We pray for those looking for truth. We ask that you can lead them to that understanding that is in your word, and that you can help us to reflect your character. Be with each person today, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.